Tonight we drift to the Bay of Naples, where soft waves touch the shore below Mount Vesuvius, and the air carries salt, pine, and the hush of evening. In this quiet corner of the Roman world, Herculaneum rests in gentle sunlight, unaware of the history sleeping ahead. Settle in now, get comfortable, and let the day slowly fall away as we begin. Here on Told History, we share calm, true stories from the past, told slowly to help you rest. If you enjoy these peaceful journeys through forgotten worlds, please like and subscribe to support the channel and future stories. And now, with the sea still breathing against the shore, let us return to ancient Herculaneum and the quiet life beneath Vesuvius. Chapter 1. The quiet shore beneath Vesuvius. Before ash, before fire, before the world remembered its name, Herculaneum was a graceful seaside town. It stood along the Bay of Naples, smaller than nearby Pompeii, yet richly adorned with villas, bathhouses, painted walls, and shaded courtyards. Here daily life moved with the sea breeze beneath the broad and watchful presence of Mount Vesuvius. In 1st century AD, Herculaneum belonged to a beautiful stretch of Roman coast favored by wealthy families. The bay curved gently under a bright Mediterranean sky, and the town rose in terraces from the water. Stone streets climbed inland, while elegant homes looked outward to the sea. Even now, the setting feels almost impossibly calm, a place arranged between mountain shadow and shining tide. The sea shaped the rhythm of this place. Fishing boats moved in and out with the light, and traders brought goods across the water from nearby ports. Along the shoreline, wooden structures and boat shelters served the needs of daily work. Above them, streets and houses gathered closely together, creating a town both practical and refined, intimate in scale, yet unmistakably Roman in character. Herculaneum was likely home to only a few thousand people, and this smaller size gave it a different feeling from larger cities. The town could be crossed on foot with ease. Neighbors would have known one another by name, by voice, by habit. Children learned familiar corners, elders passed known doorways, and merchants greeted returning customers in streets worn smooth by ordinary footsteps. The streets were narrow in places, opening suddenly into brighter spaces where sunlight touched stone and plaster. Walls carried traces of color, reds, yellows, and deep blacks carefully arranged by Roman taste. Doorways framed glimpses of inner rooms, cool courtyards, and household shrines. Even in silence, the town suggests conversation, the soft scrape of sandals, and the gentle clatter of everyday life unfolding. Roman towns were never only collections of buildings. They were patterns of habit, memory, and shared routines. In Herculaneum, water flowed through fountains, meals were prepared in kitchens, and people paused at shrines for private devotion. The ordinary world was full of repeated gestures: opening shutters, sweeping floors, buying bread, greeting a friend. These small acts, more than grand events, gave the town its soul. The houses of Herculaneum reflected both comfort and status. Some were modest, arranged around practical rooms for work and family life. Others were far grander, with mosaic floors, painted reception spaces, columns, and gardens designed for ease and display. From their terraces, the wealthy could look over the bay and enjoy the cooling air, as if the whole coast had been arranged for leisure. Among the most admired features of Roman coastal life were the baths, and Herculaneum had them too. Bathing was not only a matter of cleanliness, but of routine, comfort, and companionship. Warm rooms, hot water, marble surfaces, and changing spaces offered a familiar order to the day. Visitors passed from one chamber to another, speaking softly perhaps, while heat and steam settled over the body. Temples and shrines added another layer to the town's quiet order. Religion in Roman life was woven into home, street, and state all at once. A household altar might receive a simple offering, while public sanctuaries marked the presence of the gods in communal life. In Herculaneum, devotion did not always arrive with drama. Often it appeared in repetition, reverence, and careful attention. Markets and workshops brought texture to the town. Bakers, shopkeepers, artisans, and laborers sustained the ease enjoyed by others. Behind the beauty of painted walls stood effort. Bread kneaded before sunrise, fabric measured by hand, oil poured, tools lifted, goods counted. Herculaneum was elegant, but elegance always rested on work, and the life of the town depended upon countless tasks done well each day. Beyond the busiest streets, villas along the coast offered a more secluded kind of Roman luxury. These residences opened toward gardens, colonnades, and sea views meant to soothe the mind. Owners could read, dine, write letters, or listen to recitations in shaded rooms. Here, the sounds of the town softened, replaced by gulls, water, and the distant murmur of a world that felt safely ordered. It is easy, from our distance, to think of Herculaneum only through the disaster that later overtook it. But for those who lived there, catastrophe was not the center of life. Morning came, meals were shared, accounts were kept, repairs were made. People worried about weather, business, health, and household concerns. Their days felt immediate and ordinary, not like the opening of a legend. And above all of this stood Vesuvius. To Roman eyes in the 1st century, it was not yet known as the mountain that would destroy nearby towns in AD 79. It formed part of the landscape, large, fertile, and familiar. Vineyards grew on its slopes, and settlements thrived within its reach. What later generations would fear, this generation lived beside without alarm. That is part of what makes this story so haunting. The mountain was present, visible, and seemingly calm. The sea sparkled, trade continued, and homes remained full of thoughtful beauty. Nothing in the arrangement of streets or the order of baths and shrines demanded immediate dread. History often works this way. The turning point approaches quietly, while life continues to believe in tomorrow. As we move gently through Herculaneum, we are walking through a place preserved by an ending no one expected. Yet in this opening chapter, we stay before that moment. We listen instead to the living town. Footsteps in alleyways, talk in courtyards, doors opening to morning light. The calm matters because it was real. The people here did not know they were becoming history. Archaeology allows us to recover some of this atmosphere with unusual intimacy. Herculaneum's buildings, wooden objects, and household spaces survived in remarkable ways compared with many other ancient sites. Because of that preservation, the town can seem startlingly near. We do not see only ruins in the abstract. We sense shelves, beds, beams, and rooms where daily life had only just paused. That nearness draws us closer to the people themselves. A town is never only masonry and layout. It is made of habits, expectations, conversations, and private thoughts now lost to time. In Herculaneum, however, the spaces remain so vivid that imagination needs only a gentle invitation. We can almost follow a resident home, hear a latch lift, and feel evening air entering through an open doorway. Somewhere within this refined coastal world stood the villa of the Papyri, though its full story belongs to later chapters. For now, it rests quietly on the edge of our awareness, one more grand residence among the luxurious retreats of the bay. No one walking past its grounds could have guessed that it would one day offer the only intact library recovered from classical antiquity. So we begin not with revelation, but with stillness. The shore breathes in and out. Sunlight warms stone walls. Fountains catch and scatter the light. In kitchens and workshops and elegant halls, the business of living continues as it always has. This is the fragile power of ordinary time. It feels endless while we are inside it, even when history has already begun to gather. To understand what was lost, we first need to feel what was there. Herculaneum was not a symbol to its residents. It was home. Home meant the route to the baths, the angle of afternoon light, the smell of cooked grain, the familiar sounds from neighboring rooms. These intimate details are easy to overlook in grand history, yet they are what make the past feel human. And so this quiet shore becomes more than a setting. It becomes a threshold between memory and ruin, between the living town and the buried one, between what vanished and what astonishingly endured. We stand here gently before the great silence to come, while Herculaneum still breathes in the warm air of the bay, and Vesuvius keeps its secrets for a little longer. In the chapters ahead, we will follow that transformation across centuries, from Roman seaside life to burial, discovery, excavation, and the patient recovery of voices hidden in carbonized scrolls. But first, let this place settle around you as it once stood, graceful, sunlit, and unsuspecting. Herculaneum begins not in fire but in peace, on a quiet shore beneath the mountain. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning. Morning enters Herculaneum softly, touching plaster walls, mosaic floors, and polished tables with a pale coastal light. Here, daily life begins not in haste, but in practiced rhythm. A servant crossing an atrium, a door opening toward the street, a voice speaking quietly from another room. In this prosperous town by the Bay of Naples, comfort and order shape the hours as surely as the sun itself. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning. At the center of many homes lay the atrium, cool and dignified, with its shallow pool waiting to catch rain from the open roof above. Light gathered there and drifted into the surrounding rooms. Family portraits, small shrines, and carefully chosen decorations reminded guests that a house was more than shelter. It was reputation, memory, and an expression of cultivated Roman taste. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning. Beyond the atrium, quieter chambers offered privacy and rest. Bedrooms in Roman houses were often modest in size, yet they could still hold painted walls, simple wooden furnishings, and woven coverings that softened the space. Sleep came in rooms close to the life of the household, near footsteps in corridors, nearby voices, and the faint early sounds of work beginning somewhere beyond the inner door. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning. Kitchens were practical places, warm with embers and fragrant with oil, herbs, bread, and simmering sauces. In Herculaneum, archaeologists have found cooking spaces that suggest steady domestic routines rather than grand display. Pots blackened by fire once stood where meals were prepared for families, guests, and workers. Even in a wealthy town, nourishment depended on ordinary labor repeated carefully. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning. A Roman meal might begin simply: bread, olives, fruit, cheese, perhaps fish from the nearby sea. Yet in prosperous households, dining could also become an art of arrangement and conversation. Reclining guests discussed politics, poetry, family matters, and news from across the empire. Herculaneum was not isolated from the wider world. Its tables reflected trade routes, local abundance, and the Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning. Small household shrines known as Lauraria watched over daily routines with quiet presence. There, offerings might be placed to honor protective spirits and the well-being of the family. A gesture at the shrine could be as ordinary as lighting a lamp or setting down a little wine. Religion in Roman homes was woven into everyday life, not distant or rare, but close at hand in familiar corners. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning, painted walls brought color and imagination indoors. Reds, blacks, yellows, and delicate architectural scenes could transform a room into a stage of elegance. In Herculaneum, surviving frescoes show how carefully interiors were designed to please the eye. Even where space was limited, visual refinement mattered. A household of means announced its education and taste through art that turned ordinary walls. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning, floors too spoke quietly of skill and expense. Mosaic patterns underfoot caught the light in thousands of tiny pieces, arranged with patience into borders, figures, and geometric designs. To walk across such surfaces was to move through artistry built into the structure of the home itself. In places like Herculaneum, beauty was not always reserved for special occasions. It was part of daily habitation. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning, gardens opened the house to air, fragrance, and the soft murmur of water. Some were small inner courts planted with shrubs or flowers, while grander villas could include more elaborate green spaces with shaded paths and statuary. These cultivated gardens were neither wild nor merely decorative. They offered measured peace, a way of bringing nature into disciplined companionship with architecture. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning. In a town like Herculaneum, education formed part of respectable life. Children in wealthier families learned reading, writing, and calculation, often with help from tutors or teachers. Greek held special prestige among Romans of status, linked with philosophy, literature, and refinement. A household that valued books and study displayed more than intelligence. It displayed belonging within a wider culture. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning, reading itself was often a spoken act. Texts were read aloud, shared, discussed, and remembered through the ear as much as the eye. In cultivated circles, poetry and philosophy could move through a room in measured voices, accompanied by pauses for comment or debate. Within Herculaneum's finest houses, one can imagine this gentle exchange. Words from Greek thinkers meeting the quiet confidence of Roman. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning. Writing materials were simple, yet precious tools of thought. Wax tablets could be reused for notes and accounts, while papyrus rolls preserved more formal texts. A stylus in the hand, a scroll unrolled across the lap, a careful pause before speaking or writing. These gestures belonged to a literate world that prized memory, discipline, and learning. Even private study carried social meaning in the Roman. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning. Workshops and storerooms connected domestic comfort to practical work. Behind elegant rooms, one finds the infrastructure of ordinary prosperity. Jars for oil or wine, spaces for tools, counters for trade, and areas where goods were counted or prepared. Herculaneum lived through commerce as much as culture. The graceful front of a house often depended on many unseen routines carried out with attention. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning. Along the streets, shop fronts opened directly into the daily movement of the town. Bakers, merchants, artisans, and food sellers contributed to the steady hum of urban life. Though smaller than nearby Pompeii, Herculaneum was lively and connected, its people moving between home, market, baths, and shoreline. The town's prosperity rested not only on luxury, but on exchange of goods, services, and information. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning. The baths offered another rhythm to the day, one of cleansing, conversation, and ritualized ease. Romans visited public baths not simply to wash, but to socialize, exercise, and unwind. Warm rooms, hot baths, and cool pools created a sequence both practical and pleasurable. In a town of comfortable means, such spaces reflected the Roman talent for turning daily necessity into architecture, habit. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning. Clothing in Herculaneum would have varied by status, task, and setting, but textile softness, careful draping, and cleanliness all carried meaning. Garments announced place in the social world without needing many words. Jewelry, pins, sandals, and hairstyles added their own signals of fashion and wealth. Even in restful domestic spaces, appearance mattered, not as vanity alone, but as part of Roman. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning, seaside air shaped Herculaneum in ways both practical and subtle. The town's position on the Bay of Naples brought fish, trade, travel, and a climate admired in antiquity. From terraces and waterfront spaces, residents could look outward toward routes that linked them to Naples, Puteoli, and beyond. The sea was livelihood, horizon, and companion, always near, reflecting light into rooms and carrying. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning, at the waterfront, labor and leisure met. Boats arrived with cargo, fishermen worked the shallows, and travelers came and went beneath the changing sky. Nearby villas enjoyed the same coast in a different mood, as a place of breezes, views, and cultivated retreat. Herculaneum held both realities together. It was a lived town, not a museum of elegance, where beauty and industry stood side by side. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning, conversation threaded through every setting, at doorways, over meals, in shaded courtyards, during lessons, and while walking toward the baths. Roman life was intensely social, shaped by family bonds, patronage, friendship, and obligation. Silence existed, of course, but usually as a pause within company rather than escape from it. To understand Herculaneum is to imagine not just rooms and objects. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning, comfort in this town was carefully made. It came from plastered walls that kept interiors cool, from awnings and courtyards that moderated heat, from cisterns that stored water, and from skilled labor hidden behind polished surfaces. Roman domestic life, at its best, balanced utility with grace. Herculaneum reveals that balance clearly. A world where convenience, beauty, and routine work. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning. In wealthier residences, taste extended to sculpture, bronzes, and imported objects that connected local life to the broader empire. Such possessions did more than decorate. They placed a household within networks of trade, influence, and learning. A guest entering these rooms would read their meanings almost at once. Signs of affluence, yes, but also of education, aspiration, and participation. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning, rest had its own place within this ordered world. Midday could slow under the warmth of the sun, drawing activity inward or into shaded corners. Curtains stirred lightly, water sounds softened the air, and movement quieted for a while. Roman towns were busy, yet they also understood intervals of pause. Herculaneum's domestic spaces invited that gentler tempo, one of reflection, digestion. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning. As the hours unfolded, the household revealed itself as a small society, structured, intimate, and full of practiced roles. Masters, relatives, children, guests, freed people, and enslaved workers all contributed to its rhythm, though not equally. The grace of these interiors rested upon that unequal foundation. Even so, what remains today still speaks of shared routines, meals prepared, floors crossed. Chapter 2. In the rooms of a Roman morning. To move through Herculaneum in imagination is to feel how richly furnished ordinary life could be before the eruption of AD 79. Kitchens, gardens, reading rooms, streets, and shorelines formed a continuous world of work and repose. In that quiet prosperity, the town prepared the setting for something rarer still. A house where books were treasured, preserved by catastrophe, and eventually. Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. Above the shore at Herculaneum stood a residence of astonishing scale, spread across terraces that stepped toward the Bay of Naples. Colonnades open to light and sea air, while long walkways guided the eye outward to water and sky. Even in ruin, the place suggests quiet wealth, careful taste, and a life arranged around beauty, privacy, and the gentle rhythm of the coast. Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. Archaeologists gave the house its modern name because of what lay hidden deep inside it. A library unlike any other to survive in the classical world. Yet before we reach those shelves, it helps to linger over the villa itself. This was not a modest townhouse, but a vast seaside estate, likely owned by one of Rome's richest and most cultivated families. Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. Built on a grand plan, the residence extended farther than early excavators first imagined. Its design unfolded through connected spaces, reception rooms, gardens, covered porticos, and broad terraces that looked over the glittering bay. The house seems to have balanced display and retreat at once, offering public splendor for honored guests and more secluded corners where reading, conversation, and Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. From the upper levels, the sea would have appeared as a changing field of blue and silver, alive with morning haze and evening light. The villa's architecture welcomed these views. Open colonnades framed the horizon like a series of living paintings, allowing breezes to pass through stone corridors. In such spaces, the boundary between built form and surrounding landscape must have felt soft and almost dreamlike. Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. At the heart of many Roman luxury homes stood courtyards and gardens, and here those elements grew to remarkable scale. Long peristyles, lined with columns, created ordered paths for slow walks beneath the sun. Pools and planted areas brought reflection and shade. The repeated rhythm of column after column would have calmed the eye, turning movement through the house into something measured, ceremonial. Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. Sculpture also played a powerful role in shaping the villa's atmosphere. Excavations uncovered a celebrated group of bronzes and marbles, evidence that the owners filled these spaces with art chosen for pleasure, prestige, and learning. Statues stood along walkways in gardens and near pools, giving the estate the feeling of a private museum. Silent figures watched over the house as centuries slowly gathered about. Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. Some sculptures showed athletes, gods, and philosophers linking the household to the cultural ideals admired by Rome's elite. Art in such a setting was not merely decoration. It announced education, taste, and participation in a wider Mediterranean world shaped by Greek influence. To walk these grounds was to move through a conversation in stone and bronze, where beauty and intellect were met. Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. The villa's length and arrangement have long impressed scholars. It stretched inland and seaward with a confidence that matched the dramatic setting. Rather than rising like a fortress, it seems to have unfolded in layers, adapting to the slope beneath it. Each terrace offered a new relationship with light, garden, and water. Architecture here did not resist the landscape. It collaborated with it, gracefully and deliberately. Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. Because much of the site remained buried for so long, understanding its full plan has required patience across generations. Tunnels dug in the 18th century revealed rooms and objects, but not always the larger whole. Later study, mapping, and excavation gradually clarified the villa's vast footprint. Piece by piece, scholars began to see not just isolated chambers, but a carefully designed residence of exception. Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. Its owner is still debated, though many historians connect the estate with the Piso family, an elite Roman household of great wealth and influence. Absolute certainty remains elusive, yet the scale of the property and the quality of its artworks leave little doubt about status. This was a place for people near the top of Roman society, people with means, connections, education, and access to the finest craft. Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. In the Roman world, such a residence expressed more than luxury. It embodied a vision of cultivated life. Guests arriving here would have read its spaces closely: the sea views, the sculpture, the measured geometry, the controlled procession from room to room. All of it signaled that the household possessed not only money, but leisure, discipline, and familiarity with the intellectual traditions admired across. Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. And somewhere within this world of terraces and statues lay the feature that would one day make the villa unique in the history of archaeology: its library. The thought is quietly astonishing. Behind elegant walls and rooms meant for storage and study, texts rested on shelves while Vesuvius still seemed only part of the distant landscape. Knowledge waited there, ordinary in its own time, almost beyond value. Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. A private library in a Roman villa was not unknown, especially among the wealthy. Educated elites collected books, discussed philosophy, and cultivated Greek learning as a mark of status and serious thought. Yet what survived here was extraordinary. When the eruption came in AD 79, the scrolls were carbonized rather than simply erased. Burned, blackened, and fragile, they endured in a form no one could have expected. Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. The library appears to have contained hundreds of papyrus rolls, many written in Greek. Much of the known collection is associated with Epicurean philosophy, a school concerned with ethics, nature, peace of mind, and the limits of fear. That connection gives the villa an added stillness and imagination, a place of sea, air, and sculpture where thinkers' words were gathered carefully, then hidden by catastrophe. Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. Among the names linked to the collection is Philodemus, a Greek philosopher and poet who lived in the 1st century BC and was associated with Epicurean thought. Several recovered texts are attributed to him. His presence, whether direct or through copied works, helps us picture the library not as random storage, but as part of a living intellectual network connecting Italy with older traditions of learning. Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. Imagine the shelves before the disaster. Rolls arranged in order, each tagged for identification, each holding arguments, verses, or reflections copied by careful hands. To the household, these texts may have felt familiar and readily replaceable, part of a broader literary culture. No one inside those rooms could have guessed that ordinary papyrus, so vulnerable to time, would become the only intact library. Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. That singular survival is what gives the site its immense importance. Elsewhere, ancient libraries are known through references, fragments, and loss. Here, though damaged beyond easy reading, an entire collection remained together in the place where it had been kept. The villa therefore preserves not just individual texts, but a moment in the intellectual life of the Roman world. A snapshot sealed the Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. The eruption that buried Herculaneum transformed the house with terrible force. Volcanic flows and intense heat overwhelmed rooms, furniture, and bodies, then sealed the remains beneath deep deposits. For the library, this destruction became a strange form of protection. The scrolls were charred into delicate cylinders, their writing hidden inside blackened layers. Catastrophe did not spare them. Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. When excavators encountered these objects in the 18th century, many did not at first understand what they were. Dark, brittle lumps could easily resemble pieces of charcoal or burnt wood. Slowly, recognition dawned. These were rolled manuscripts. The realization changed the meaning of the site forever. A grand Roman villa was remarkable enough, but a buried library within it raised the discovery into Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. From that moment, the villa became one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in the ancient world. Its architecture illuminated elite Roman life, its sculptures enriched the history of art, and its scrolls opened a narrow but precious window into lost literature. Few places unite domestic space, aesthetic ambition, and textual survival so completely. The estate stands where luxury and Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. Even now, the site holds a certain mystery. Much has been recovered, much has been studied, and yet large questions remain about the full extent of the building and the complete contents of its library. This incompleteness adds to the villa's quiet power. It feels less like a finished story than a conversation still unfolding, one in which stone, ash, and technology continue to reveal new answers slowly. Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. To think of the house only as a ruin is to miss something essential. It was once animated by footsteps, sea wind, careful reading, and the small sounds of domestic life. Servants moved through corridors. Guests admired artworks. Someone selected a scroll and carried it into better light. In that ordinary motion lies the deeper wonder of the site. A vanished world preserved not in legend, but in matter. Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. The long views over the bay, the ordered terraces, the gleam of bronze figures, and the hidden chambers of books all belong to one unified vision. This was a residence designed to place art, landscape, and thought in close companionship. Its survival, though broken and incomplete, allows us to approach that vision across 2,000 years. The villa still invites us inward, quietly, patiently, and with immense. Chapter 3. The Villa of the Papyri. As we leave these terraces for now, the library remains waiting at the center of the story, darkened scrolls preserved against all expectation. In the next part of our journey, those silent rolls will move closer into view, along with the early attempts to open them and understand their fragile contents. For now, let the villa rest above the sea, vast, elegant, and full of hidden thought. Chapter 4. The Day the Mountain Opened. Morning in Herculaneum may have seemed almost ordinary, with the sea resting quietly below the slopes of Vesuvius. Yet by late August, in AD 79, the mountain that had long watched over the town began to change. A rising column of ash and gas climbed into the sky, widening like a pine tree. Beneath that strange cloud, daily life started to falter, and calm gave way to dread. Chapter 4. The Day the Mountain Opened. Ancient witnesses, especially Pliny the Younger, help us imagine the first hours of the eruption. The sky darkened in uneven stages as ash drifted outward and small stones began to fall. People looked upward, trying to understand what they were seeing. Some gathered belongings, some prayed, and some simply waited, hoping the mountain's violence would pass as suddenly as it had begun. Chapter 4. The Day the Mountain Opened. Across the Bay of Naples, the eruption unfolded with terrifying scale, but Herculaneum did not face the same danger at the same moment as Pompeii. Early winds carried much of the falling pumice away from the town. For a time, that difference may have created a fragile illusion of safety. Streets still stood open, and escape may have seemed possible, even as the mountain continued building its force. Chapter 4. The Day the Mountain Opened. As the hours passed, daylight thinned beneath a growing veil of ash. The air would have felt altered, dry, bitter, and difficult to trust. Fine particles settled over roofs, courtyards, and pathways, soft at first, almost gentle in their descent. But every drifting layer carried a warning. The mountain was not quieting. It was preparing, gathering pressure and heat beyond what anyone in the town could have. Chapter 4. The Day the Mountain Opened. In many disasters, the most frightening moment is not the beginning, but the waiting. Herculaneum entered that uneasy interval as the eruption continued through the day and into the night. Sounds may have traveled strangely through the darkness, distant crashes, trembling ground, the muffled fall of debris. Families sheltered where they could. Others moved toward the waterfront, perhaps believing. Chapter 4. The Day the Mountain Opened. Near the shoreline, archaeologists later found the remains of people who had gathered inside boat chambers and along the beach. Their presence suggests a final, desperate hope of escape by sea. They had come as close as possible to the water, waiting beneath the shadow of the mountain. Around them, the world was narrowing. Sea ahead, volcanic darkness behind, and no clear path left between the two. Chapter 4. The Day the Mountain Opened. Then the danger changed form. Herculaneum was struck not mainly by falling ash alone, but by pyroclastic surges, fast-moving clouds of scorching gas, ash, and volcanic fragments. These surges traveled down from Vesuvius with overwhelming speed and heat. They did not arrive like a slow storm. They came as a force that erased shelter, outran human movement, and transformed the town in a matter of moments. Chapter 4. The Day the Mountain Opened. The first surge to reach Herculaneum was deadly enough to end lives almost instantly. Modern study suggests temperatures were extreme, far beyond what buildings, bodies, or belongings could endure. Wooden structures charred, organic materials shrank or hardened, breath itself became impossible. The town that had once opened toward gardens, baths, and sea air was engulfed by a darkness hotter than flame. Chapter 4. The day the mountain opened. More surges followed. They swept through streets, houses, workshops, and storerooms, carrying ash and volcanic debris into every opening. Walls cracked under pressure. Upper rooms collapsed. Spaces once filled with conversation and household routine became sealed chambers of heat and dust. The eruption was no longer an event in the distance. It had entered every part of Herculaneum, filling the town complete. Chapter 4. The day the mountain opened. At the villa of the Papyri, the effects were especially strange and important. This grand seaside residence, set beyond the town, held a library of papyrus scrolls. Under ordinary fire, such delicate rolls might have burned away entirely. But the conditions here were different. The intense heat and lack of oxygen in varied spaces caused many scrolls to carbonize, blacken, fragile, and closed, yet still. Chapter 4. The day the mountain opened. Carbonization is a harsh kind of preservation. It destroys softness, color, and flexibility, but can leave form behind. In Herculaneum, wooden furniture, food remains, and papyrus were altered in this severe way. The scrolls did not survive as living objects ready to be opened and read. They survived as compressed witnesses, damaged almost beyond recognition, yet not erased, held in darkness merely. Chapter 4. The day the mountain opened. After the surges came a terrible stillness. The violence of motion settled into weight. Layers of volcanic material accumulated over Herculaneum, eventually burying much of the town beneath many meters of hardened deposits. Streets disappeared. Roof lines vanished. Familiar boundaries between room and road, villa and shoreline were swallowed. What had been a living place became a sealed landscape. Chapter 4. The day the mountain opened. This burial was both ruin and protection. The same material that destroyed the town also enclosed it, limiting air, moisture, and later disturbance. In other ancient sites, centuries of weather, rebuilding, and human reuse can scatter the past into fragments. Herculaneum was different. It was locked away. Doors, beams, shelves, and scrolls remained where the eruption left them, preserved not gently, but with. Chapter 4. The day the mountain opened. The changing sky of that day deserves a quiet place in memory. Witnesses described clouds unlike anything familiar, a towering plume spreading high above the mountain. Below it, light weakened into a dim and unsettling gloom. Ash drifted down in silence between louder moments of collapse and shock. The heavens themselves seemed altered, as if day were being folded closed, one gray layer at a time over seas. Chapter 4. The day the mountain opened. It is easy, from a distance of centuries, to think only of grand forces, magma, pressure, eruption columns, surges. But every buried object in Herculaneum belonged to a smaller human rhythm. A cup set down, a door left ajar, a shelf of scrolls arranged by a careful hand. When the mountain opened, those rhythms stopped mid-motion, and the ordinary world was fixed in the instant of its ending. Chapter 4. The day the mountain opened. Archaeology has revealed how sudden that ending could be. In some places, carbonized wood still preserves the shape of doors or beds. In others, storage jars remain near where they stood in kitchens and workrooms. Such details do not soften the tragedy, but they clarify it. Herculaneum was not lost in myth. It was a real town, interrupted abruptly, its textures and habits sealed beneath volcanic stone. Chapter 4. The day the mountain opened. The scrolls themselves rested through this silence in a condition that must have seemed hopeless when first discovered. Dark, brittle, and tightly rolled, they looked more like lumps of charcoal than books. Some were damaged by early attempts to open them. Yet even in their ruined state, they carried an extraordinary promise. Within those blackened forms, ancient writing might still endure, waiting for method. Chapter 4. The day the mountain opened. That is one of history's quiet paradoxes. Destruction sometimes preserves what ordinary time would have worn away. Had Vesuvius never erupted, the villa's library might have vanished through decay, neglect, reuse, or simple accident. Instead, the scrolls were trapped in a brutal shelter. Fire transformed them. Burial concealed them. And so the mountain that ended one world also prevented all of Chapter 4. The day the mountain opened. The people of Herculaneum could not have known that future generations would search these ruins for meaning. They knew only the immediate reality of ash, heat, confusion, and fear. For them, the mountain's opening was not a chapter in history but the collapse of the familiar. Home, memory, and tomorrow were all placed at once under the same falling darkness, beyond rescue and beyond explanation. Chapter 4. The day the mountain opened. In the hours after burial, nothing in the town moved again. The harbor edge changed. Buildings filled and hardened. Rooms that had sheltered statues, tables, lamps, and scrolls fell into a long volcanic sleep. Above them, the world continued. Empires shifted, languages changed, and generations passed. Below, Herculaneum remained closed, its silence deeper with every century, preserving traces of life. Chapter 4. The day the mountain opened. For the library, this silence was essential. Papyri is usually one of the most perishable of ancient materials, vulnerable to damp, handling, insects, and fire. Yet here, inside buried rooms of the villa, a rare chain of conditions allowed many rolls to persist in altered form. They were unreadable to the eye at first glance, but they had not vanished. Their words remained hidden inside carbonized layers. Chapter 4. The day the mountain opened. So this chapter rests in two truths at once. It is the story of sudden loss, of lives cut short, and a town overwhelmed by volcanic force. But it is also the beginning of an unlikely survival. Within the sealed ruin, objects too fragile for ordinary history endured. Among them were the Herculaneum scrolls, dark and silent, carrying philosophy forward through ash, heat, and nearly 2 millennia of night. Chapter 4. The day the mountain opened. When we think of Vesuvius in AD 79, we often picture spectacle. Yet Herculaneum asks for a quieter remembrance. It asks us to notice the fine ash settling first, the long hours of uncertainty, the rush of unbearable heat, and then the silence after. In that silence, destruction became preservation. The town disappeared from sight, but its sealed rooms held fast to voices, objects, and unfinished. Chapter 4. The day the mountain opened. Buried beneath volcanic layers, Herculaneum entered a darkness that would last for centuries. The mountain had closed over houses, baths, shorelines, and the villa's precious library. Yet nothing was entirely gone. In blackened papyrus, in carbonized wood, and in rooms sealed against air, the past remained. From this stillness, the next part of the story will begin, not with eruption, but with rediscovery underground. Chapter 5. A library sleeping under ash. Above the buried shoreline, seasons turned without witness. Rain fell, grasses rooted, and generations passed across a changed coast. Beneath it all, the villa rested in a sealed and breathless dark, wrapped in volcanic layers hardened by time. The rooms that once held voices, footsteps, and quiet reading now held only stillness, and in that stillness, the library began its long wait underground. Chapter 5. A library sleeping under ash. The eruption that destroyed Herculaneum also preserved it in an unexpected way. Waves of scorching material buried buildings quickly, then cooled into dense deposits that shielded what lay inside. In the villa, shelves collapsed, timbers blackened, and scrolls were transformed by heat into fragile cylinders of carbonized papyrus. Yet because they remained buried and largely undisturbed, they in Chapter 5, a library sleeping under ash. Centuries above ground moved with all the restlessness of human history. The Roman world changed, divided, and faded. New rulers came to Campania, languages shifted, faiths spread, roads altered their courses, and memories thinned. Yet below those unseen layers, the buried library did not participate in any of it. It lay outside politics and fashion, beyond ambition and noise, held in a silence deeper than Chapter 5. A library sleeping under ash. There is something almost unimaginable about that duration. For nearly 2,000 years, the scrolls remained closed in darkness. No hand reached for them. No lamp was raised nearby. No reader searched a passage or paused over a sentence. The thoughts written there, likely in Greek, waited without impatience. Time pressed onward above, but below, the library entered a state that felt less like death. Chapter 5. A library sleeping under ash. The buried villa became part of the earth itself. Ash compacted, volcanic mud hardened, stone and soil gathered over roofs, walls, and corridors until architecture turned into hidden geology. Anyone walking overhead would have seen only ordinary ground, with no sign that beneath their steps rested courtyards, statues, and one of antiquity's most remarkable collections of books. History did not vanish completely. Chapter 5. A library sleeping under ash. Preservation often sounds active, as if something must be carefully guarded. Here, preservation came through abandonment and stillness. The scrolls survived not because they were cherished continuously, but because they were left alone beneath protected ruin. No damp storeroom slowly rotted them. No later fire consumed them. No recycling hand scraped away their text. Burial, catastrophic at first. Chapter 5. A library sleeping under ash. In other parts of the ancient Mediterranean, libraries disappeared through war, weather, neglect, and reuse. Papyrus was always vulnerable. It frayed, molded, burned, and crumbled with ease. That is why the Herculaneum scrolls are so extraordinary. They did not survive in spite of disaster alone, but because disaster sealed them away from ordinary decay. Their condition was tragic, yes, yet also unique. Chapter 5. A library sleeping under ash. Imagine the darkness in those rooms after burial. Not the gentle dimness of evening, but a complete absence of day. No sea light reached the villa. No window opened onto the Bay of Naples. The library existed in perfect concealment, each rolled manuscript held inside the earth's heavy quiet. It is a haunting thought that ideas once copied by careful hands could continue existing, unread but Chapter 5. A library sleeping under ash. Above ground, empires rose and fell with the usual certainty of impermanence. The Western Roman Empire ended. Medieval kingdoms formed. Dynasties governed southern Italy. Traders crossed the Mediterranean. Monasteries preserved other texts, and cities expanded and shrank. Through all of it, the villa below remained unchanged in its hidden chambered sleep. Human history rushed onward in countless. Chapter 5. A library sleeping under ash. This chapter of the story asks us to think about time differently. We often imagine history as movement, conquests, inventions, speeches, departures. But sometimes history survives through waiting. Sometimes the most important act is not action at all, but endurance. The scrolls beneath Herculaneum were not traveling through the centuries in triumph. They were simply remaining where they had fallen. Chapter 5. A library sleeping under ash. Somewhere in that buried collection were lines composed by ancient thinkers, copied by scribes, stored by readers who expected future study. Those expectations were broken in AD 79, yet not entirely erased. The chain of transmission paused instead of ending. Across the long darkness, the scrolls kept hold of language in a damaged but persistent form. Even unread, they continued to bear witness. Chapter 5. A library sleeping under ash. Patience belongs strangely to buried things. A seed may wait in dry ground. A shipwreck may rest below waves. The villa's library waited under ash with a patience no human could practice. It did not measure years, kingdoms, or centuries. It simply remained. And because it remained, the possibility of recovery remained with it. Faint at first, unimaginable for long stretches, then one day real enough. Chapter 5. A library sleeping under ash. There is also a tenderness in this stillness. These were once useful objects, made to be handled, opened, discussed, and perhaps argued over. Burial ended that living purpose, but it gave them another. In silence, they became messengers to a future they would never know. Their words were hidden, their forms distorted, yet their existence endured. The library slept not as a monument only, but as a promise. Chapter 5. A library sleeping under ash. If we could stand above the villa during those lost centuries, we would hear none of it. No cracking shelf, no whisper of papyrus, no sign from the rooms below. The buried library offered no dramatic signal. Its survival was utterly quiet. That may be why it feels so moving though. In a world that often celebrates what is loud and immediate, these scrolls were preserved by doing nothing at all except last. Chapter 5. A library sleeping under ash. Volcanic burial is usually imagined as destruction, and rightly so. Lives were interrupted, homes obliterated, and a town vanished. Yet history is full of paradox, and this is one of its most striking. The same event that entombed the library also guarded it from the weathering centuries. Loss and preservation became inseparable. The ash that silenced readers also protected reading itself. Not in Chapter 5. A library sleeping under ash. Perhaps that is why the villa feels less like a ruin than a pause. A pause stretched almost beyond comprehension, but a pause nonetheless. The rooms did not continue their old life, yet neither were they erased beyond recovery. They existed in suspension, waiting for the world above to develop the curiosity and care required to uncover them. The library beneath ash became a meeting place between them. Chapter 5. A library sleeping under ash. While the scrolls lay hidden, other ancient works disappeared forever. Plays, poems, histories, and philosophical texts known only by title slipped from the human record. That larger loss makes Herculaneum feel even more precious. Here was a place where at least some part of the classical written world had not been entirely surrendered. Damaged, carbonized, and unreachable for centuries, yes, but Chapter 5, a library sleeping under ash. The library's survival also reminds us how accidental the historical record can be. What we know from antiquity is not simply what was most valued, but what happened to escape destruction. A buried villa near Vesuvius, preserved by catastrophe, could outlast countless safer places. It is a humbling thought. Memory does not always travel by careful design. Sometimes it survives through chance. Chapter 5. A library sleeping under ash. In that sense, the scrolls were never truly gone. They were absent from knowledge, but not absent from existence. They remained where heat had blackened them, occupying their dark shelves and collapsed spaces, waiting beneath compressed layers that sealed off the centuries. This distinction matters. Forgotten is not always lost. Hidden is not always destroyed. Beneath Herculaneum, the library. Chapter 5. A library sleeping under ash. You can almost feel the weight above them. Soil, stone, hardened ash, and time itself. And yet the scrolls persisted in that pressure. Not unchanged, certainly, but preserved enough to remain meaningful. Their patience was physical. Their survival was material. The library did not endure as a legend or rumor alone, but as real objects in real darkness, awaiting the slow arrival of discovery many lifetimes beyond. Chapter 5. A library sleeping under ash. The meditative power of this story lies in its stillness. Nothing dramatic happens during these buried centuries, and that is precisely the point. Human lives flash by quickly. States expand and collapse. Names are remembered, then forgotten. But below ground, the library passed through the ages without event. Its long quiet became a vessel of preservation. In a way, the absence of motion protected the possibility. Chapter 5. A library sleeping under ash. When later generations finally approached the buried town, they were not awakening a dead world so much as entering a silence that had held firm for ages. The villa had been waiting without intention, and yet waiting all the same. Every corridor, every chamber, every carbonized roll belonged to a past suddenly brought near again. The library's patience had outlived empire, language, and memory. Chapter 5. A library sleeping under ash. So the image we carry from this chapter is a simple one. A library beneath layers of volcanic earth, closed to the world yet not erased from it. Above, history continued with all its noise and uncertainty. Below, the scrolls endured by resting in perfect concealment. They ask us to imagine preservation not as triumph, but as quiet survival, the kind that asks for no witness until at last one arrives. Chapter 5. A library sleeping under ash. And there, in the deep buried hush, the manuscripts kept their vigil through the passing centuries. They did not know Rome had fallen, or kingdoms changed, or modern curiosity would someday descend toward them. They simply remained, fragile, blackened, hidden, and astonishingly present. In the next part of our story, that long sleep will begin to break as human hands once more draw near to the villa. Chapter 6. Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. By the 18th century, the buried towns near Vesuvius had rested in darkness for well over 1,600 years. Fields, vineyards, and quiet paths lay above them. Then, under Bourbon rule in southern Italy, curiosity deepened into organized digging. What had long been hidden beneath volcanic stone would slowly begin to return. Not all at once, but through narrow passages, lantern light, and Chapter 6. Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. The story of Herculaneum's rediscovery unfolded during the reign of Charles of Bourbon, later Charles III of Spain. In the 1730s, interest in ancient remains around Naples was growing steadily. Royal patronage gave excavations money, workers, and purpose. Yet archaeology as we know it did not yet exist. These first searches were driven by wonder, prestige, and treasure as much as by scholarship. Chapter 6. Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. Herculaneum was harder to reach than Pompeii would later be. The town lay beneath a deep, hardened mass of volcanic material, dense and compact like stone. Instead of clearing open streets from above, early excavators often cut shafts down into the buried layers. From those shafts, they tunneled sideways through the darkness. It was a method more like mining than modern excavation. Bold, effective, and Chapter 6. Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. Imagine the atmosphere below ground. Workers descended through tight vertical openings, carrying lamps into airless spaces where walls, statues, and painted rooms might suddenly emerge from the gloom. Every chamber must have felt like a secret interrupted. The ancient city did not reveal itself in broad daylight at first. It appeared in fragments, a section of wall here, a corridor there. Chapter 6. Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. Among the key figures in these efforts was the engineer Roque Joaquin de Alcubierre, who directed important early excavations beginning in 1738. His work helped uncover Herculaneum and later Pompeii, though his methods have often been criticized by later scholars. Records could be incomplete, context was sometimes lost. Still, through these imperfect beginnings, the buried world of Chapter 6. Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. The Bourbon court was captivated by what the ground yielded. Sculptures, inscriptions, and elegant objects from the Roman past stirred excitement across Europe. The finds fed a growing fascination with classical antiquity, helping shape taste, collecting, and scholarship. Yet each object removed from its setting also lost part of its story. The Age of Rediscovery carried both brilliance and blind. Chapter 6. Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. In 1750, tunneling at Herculaneum reached an extraordinary complex later called the Villa of the Papyri. The discovery is often linked to Carl Jakob Weber, a Swiss military engineer whose careful plans became invaluable. The villa proved immense and luxurious, with colonnades, gardens, and rich decoration. Beneath the volcanic deposit, a grand Roman residence had survived in astonishing form. Chapter 6. Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. Weber's contribution stands out because he worked with more care than many of his contemporaries. His maps and drawings help preserve relationships between rooms, corridors, and objects that tunneling could easily erase. In a buried site, context is delicate. Once a wall is broken or a layer disturbed, something meaningful may vanish forever. Weber understood, at least in part, that the arrangement. Chapter 6. Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. As passages opened inside the villa, excavators encountered a world of refinement. Bronze and marble statues appeared in number, suggesting a residence of wealth and learning. Decorative spaces hinted at conversation, leisure, and cultivated taste. This was not merely a storehouse of art, but a home shaped by ideals. Somewhere within these rooms, beyond the beauty of sculpture, another treasure remained. Chapter 6. Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. Then came one of the most remarkable moments in the history of archaeology. In rooms of the villa, excavators found strange dark cylinders and lumps, blackened and brittle. At first glance, they seemed like pieces of charcoal or burned wood. It would have been easy to dismiss them, yet these unassuming objects were something else entirely. Ancient papyrus scrolls, carbonized by the eruption but not wholly destroyed. Chapter 6. Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. To recognize a burnt object as a book requires a special kind of imagination. These scrolls no longer resembled the pale writing rolls of an active library. Heat had transformed them into delicate black forms, easily shattered by touch, and yet their shape remained. Some still held the memory of being rolled. In that eerie recognition, the past changed again. A buried house had become the site of Chapter 6. Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. The library of the Villa of the Papyri was astonishing not only because texts survived, but because any papyrus survived at all. Normally, such material decays with time and moisture. Here, volcanic heat carbonized the rolls, and burial protected them from ordinary rot. The same catastrophe that ended life in Herculaneum also created rare conditions of preservation, destruction, and survival. Chapter 6. Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. One can imagine the first reactions among those who understood what had been found. Not merely statues or ornaments, but thoughts themselves. Writing once read by Roman eyes, now returning after nearly 2 millennia. The excitement must have been immense. A library promised voices, arguments, teachings, memory. It hinted at the inner life of the villa's owner and guests. In those blackened rolls lay Chapter 6, Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. But wonder did not automatically bring knowledge of how to preserve such delicate things. 18th-century excavators faced materials no one had expected to recover in this form. Handling the scrolls was dangerous. Attempts to separate layers could break them apart. Some were damaged beyond recovery. Others were opened only with great difficulty. The discovery was magnificent, yet it arrived. Chapter 6. Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. Early efforts to open the scrolls were often experimental, improvised, and risky. In time, techniques were developed to unroll some of them more successfully, including methods associated with Antonio Piaggio in the later 18th century. Even so, progress was painfully slow. Each roll presented its own dangers. Pages could stick, crumble, or vanish into dust. To read a text, one first had to read. Chapter 6. Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. The scrolls were eventually found to contain mostly Greek texts, many linked to Epicurean philosophy, including works associated with Philodemus. This was itself an extraordinary window into Roman intellectual life. A villa near the Bay of Naples had preserved not only luxurious art, but a scholarly tradition. The owners or residents valued books enough to gather them in significant number. Chapter 6. Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. Rediscovery also changed Europe beyond the excavation tunnels. News of Herculaneum and its treasures spread through letters, collections, and learned conversation. Artists, antiquarians, and rulers took notice. Classical forms gained fresh immediacy when they rose, almost literally from the earth. The buried city became part of a wider awakening to the ancient Mediterranean. Still, much of that awakening was select. Chapter 6. Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. It is easy, looking back, to judge the early excavators solely by modern standards. Yet it is fairer and more human to see them as standing at the threshold of a new kind of knowledge. They were discovering not only ruins, but the need for better methods. Every mistake revealed a limit. Every damaged object taught a lesson too late. Archaeology was being born in the dark, amid excitement, ambition, and irreversibility. Chapter 6. Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. The tunnels themselves became part of the story. Unlike broad modern trenches, they offered selective glimpses and forced decisions about what to follow, what to remove, and what to leave behind. An excavation path might cut through walls or bypass entire spaces. What was found depended partly on where one dug and why. Beneath the surface, chance worked alongside intention, shaping the record. Chapter 6. Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. The Villa of the Papyri remains especially evocative because it joins physical beauty with intellectual survival. Statues can show us taste, status, and style. Architecture can suggest movement, privacy, and pleasure, but books reveal habits of thought. They preserve argument, memory, and curiosity. In this villa, the ancient world offered both its outward splendor and something inward. A trace. Chapter 6. Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. There is something deeply moving in the image of those carbonized scrolls resting unseen for centuries. While kingdoms rose and fell above them, farmers walked the ground, rulers changed, languages shifted, and all the while, words written in Greek endured underground in fragile silence. Their survival was improbable in the extreme, their rediscovery equally so. History sometimes returns not with. Chapter 6. Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. By the end of the 18th century, Herculaneum had already become a place of fascination, difficulty, and promise. It had yielded masterpieces, but also puzzles. It had inspired wonder, but demanded restraint that the era could not always provide. The Papyri stood at the center of this tension. They were found too early for perfect care, yet not too early to survive altogether. Their future remained uncertain. Chapter 6. Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. In this chapter, rediscovery is not a single triumphant moment, but a slow awakening. Shafts were sunk, tunnels advanced, rooms emerged, statues appeared. Then, in a quieter miracle, books returned to human attention after almost 2,000 years. The process was messy, imperfect, and sometimes harmful. Still, through all those limitations, something extraordinary endured. A conversation from Chapter 6, Rediscovery in the Age of Kings. And so the buried library entered modern history in fragments, half understood, delicately handled, and surrounded by hope. The Bourbon excavations opened a door, even as they sometimes damaged what lay beyond it. From darkness came statues, rooms, and scrolls that would challenge generations of scholars. The wonder of Herculaneum was no longer only that it had been preserved, but that it could. Chapter 7. The fragile art of opening the past. In the 18th century, scholars stood before the carbonized scrolls with wonder and uncertainty. They had in their hands a library from the ancient world, yet each roll seemed more like a piece of charcoal than a book. The first challenge was painfully simple to describe and terribly hard to solve. How do you open a text that may crumble at a touch? Chapter 7. The fragile art of opening the past. Early investigators approached the scrolls with the habits of their own age. They expected paper or parchment to yield, however stiffly, to patient hands and careful tools. But these rolls had been transformed by volcanic heat into brittle cylinders, compressed and fused. What looked solid was often layered fragility, a structure that could split, flake, or collapse before a single line had been. Chapter 7. The fragile art of opening the past. The desire to read them was irresistible. Here perhaps were lost histories, poems, or philosophical works thought vanished for centuries. So mechanical methods were tried with earnest hope. Threads, weights, tiny adjustments, and carefully devised frames were used to coax a scroll outward a little at a time. Each effort carried optimism, and each effort carried danger hidden in every resisting fiber. Chapter 7. The fragile art of opening the past. One of the most important early figures in this work was the conservator Antonio Piaggio, a priest from the Vatican Library. In the 1750s, he developed a machine intended to unroll the papyri with extreme slowness. The method was ingenious for its time. Small sections were teased apart and attached so that tension could lift layers gradually, sometimes over months or even longer. Chapter 7. The fragile art of opening the past. Piaggio's device represented patience made mechanical. It did not force the scroll open all at once. Instead, it relied on tiny movements, repeated carefully, in the hope that the material might surrender without shattering. Yet even this gentler approach could not change the nature of the papyri themselves. They had survived burial, fire, pressure, and centuries underground. But survival had. Chapter 7. The fragile art of opening the past. Some scrolls yielded a little, others resisted completely. Layers stuck together as if welded by heat, and the attempt to separate them could tear away the writing itself. At times, the surface came free in fragments too small to reconstruct with confidence. The irony was painful. The more eagerly one tried to recover the words, the greater the chance of destroying them, page by page, before reading could even begin. Chapter 7. The Fragile Art of Opening the Past. Through the late 18th century and into the 19th, the work continued under the long shadow of uncertainty. Scholars, librarians, engineers, and rulers all hoped the buried library might reveal masterpieces of antiquity, but many openings ended in disappointment. A roll might seem promising from the outside, then disintegrate into dark splinters when touched. The archive was present, visible. Chapter 7. The Fragile Art of Opening the Past. There were also less successful experiments, born from desperation as much as curiosity. Techniques involving moisture, chemicals, or heat were considered or attempted in different periods, often with harmful results. Scholars were working before modern conservation science, and sometimes they had to learn by damaging the very thing they wished to preserve. The tragedy was not carelessness alone. Chapter 7. The Fragile Art of Opening the Past. As pieces were opened and copied, a broad pattern slowly emerged. Much of the readable material appeared to be written in Greek, not Latin. This was an important clue about the library and its owner. It suggested a collection shaped by learned taste, philosophy, and the intellectual traditions of the Eastern Mediterranean. The villa was Roman, but the mind preserved within many of its shelves. Chapter 7. The Fragile Art of Opening the Past. Over time, the philosophical character of the collection became clearer. Many texts were associated with Epicureanism, the school founded by Epicurus in Athens around 300 BC. Epicurean thought is often misunderstood today. It did not simply praise pleasure in a careless sense. Rather, it sought tranquility, friendship, moderation, and freedom from fear. In the blackened papyri of Herculaneum, Chapter 7, The Fragile Art of Opening the Past. Among the names linked most closely with the scrolls was Philodemus of Gadara, an Epicurean philosopher and poet of the 1st century BC. Several works attributed to him were identified among the recovered texts. This helped scholars understand the nature of the villa's collection more clearly. It was not a random store of books. It was, at least in part, a serious philosophical library. Curate Chapter 7, The Fragile Art of Opening the Past. That realization gave the scrolls a special emotional weight. They were not merely relics from a destroyed town. They were the remains of sustained intellectual life, argument, reflection, teaching, memory. To hold one was to stand within touching distance of a Roman-era reader who had once unrolled it with ordinary ease. Yet now, nearly 2,000 years later, the same gesture had become perilous. Chapter 7. The Fragile Art of Opening the Past. The labor of decipherment was as delicate as the labor of opening. Ink on these papyri could be faint and difficult to distinguish from the carbonized background. Even when a section survived being unrolled, scholars still had to identify letters, restore gaps, and compare fragments. Progress came slowly, through magnifying lenses, copied transcripts, and long debate. Every recovered word felt hard. Chapter 7. The Fragile Art of Opening the Past. Throughout the 19th century, the promise of hidden texts continued to haunt the scholarly imagination. If the open scrolls already contained valuable philosophical works, what might still lie unread in the many rolls left intact? Histories lost from classical literature, dramas no longer known, teachings preserved nowhere else, all seemed possible. Yet possibility itself. Chapter 7. The Fragile Art of Opening the Past. This was the strange condition of the Herculaneum collection. It was neither wholly lost nor fully found. Unlike books destroyed without trace, these survived in physical form. Unlike ordinary manuscripts, they could not simply be opened and read. They occupied an unsettling middle state, preserved enough to inspire hope, damaged enough to resist understanding. Few discoveries in the history of Chapter 7. The Fragile Art of Opening the Past. Gradually, conservators and scholars began to accept a difficult truth. some scrolls could not be physically opened without unacceptable risk. The traditional act of reading, so familiar and direct, had reached its limits here. Hands, blades, threads, and mechanical patience could only go so far. Beyond that point, intervention became injury. This realization was humbling. It asked learned people. Chapter 7. The fragile art of opening the past. Such restraint was not a surrender of curiosity. It was a new form of care. To leave a scroll unopened was to trust that future generations might develop safer methods than those presently available. In that sense, silence itself became part of the archive. The unread rolls were not failures alone. They were messages deferred, invitations sent forward in time to readers and technologies not. Chapter 7. The fragile art of opening the past. For those who studied the papyri, frustration became a constant companion. They knew writing was there. In some cases, the shape of layers and faint traces of columns confirmed it. Knowledge existed physically before their eyes, yet withheld its voice. Few experiences in scholarship are stranger than this. To stand so near to a text, to preserve it with devotion, and still be unable to hear what it says in Chapter 7, the fragile art of opening the past. And still, the partial recoveries mattered enormously. Each identified treatise, each recognizable philosophical argument, each recovered title expanded the map of ancient thought. The Herculaneum rolls reminded historians that classical literature once existed in a broader landscape than what medieval copying happened to preserve. Survival was never neutral. What reaches us from antiquity is only a Chapter 7. The fragile art of opening the past. The Greek nature of so much of the library also deepened our picture of Roman elite culture. In the late Republic and early Empire, educated Romans often read Greek philosophy and poetry as part of their intellectual world. The Villa of the Papyri seems to reflect that reality vividly. Buried in Campania, in a Roman house, was a collection speaking in Greek about ethics, nature, and peace of mind. Chapter 7. The fragile art of opening the past. There is something almost tender in imagining the scrolls waiting through the ages. Not alive, of course, but suspended in a kind of long stillness. Around them, empires rose and fell, languages changed, libraries burned, and whole traditions vanished. Yet these rolls remained under hardened ash, carrying arguments about the good life from a vanished shore of the ancient Mediterranean. Their silent. Chapter 7. The fragile art of opening the past. By the modern era, the lesson was clear. The history of the scrolls was not only a story of discovery, but of limits. Human ingenuity had brought them back from burial, identified their importance, and recovered part of their contents. Yet ingenuity had also damaged some beyond repair. Knowledge alone was not enough. What was needed was patience, disciplined by humility. The wisdom to recognize. Chapter 7. The fragile art of opening the past. In this way, the unopened Herculaneum papyri became symbols of a larger human longing. We want the past to speak plainly, to hand over its secrets intact, to reward our searching with immediate clarity. But history rarely works so gently. Sometimes it offers fragments, stains, shadows, and sealed surfaces. Sometimes it asks us to wait beside the closed door of understanding, knowing that the Chapter 7, the fragile art of opening the past. So this chapter leaves us with a library half heard, Greek voices, Epicurean reflections, and countless darkened rolls still guarding their contents. The scholars of the 18th century and after did not fail because they lacked devotion. They reached the edge of what their methods allowed, and there, at the threshold of unread knowledge, they left a challenge for the future, to open the past without break. Chapter 8. New Eyes for Ancient Ink. By the modern age, scholars had learned a painful lesson from the scrolls of Herculaneum. Force and haste could destroy what fire had strangely spared. So a quieter hope emerged. Instead of prying the brittle layers apart by hand, researchers began asking whether light, scanning, and careful computation might look inward gently and let the blackened papyri remain physically at rest. Chapter 8. New Eyes for Ancient Ink. This new approach was non-invasive in spirit as well as method. The scroll would not be pressed flat or opened with blades. It would be examined as it was, a fragile cylinder of carbonized layers folded by heat and time. The task became one of patient observation, to gather hidden information from within, then rebuild the shape digitally, almost as if tracing thought through shadow. Chapter 8. New Eyes for Ancient Ink. One important tool in this effort was high-resolution X-ray imaging, especially forms of microcomputed tomography. In simple terms, this meant taking many X-ray views through the object from different angles, then using them to create a three-dimensional model. Instead of seeing only the surface, researchers could study the inner structure, layer by layer, curve by curve, without touching the papyrus itself. Chapter 8. New Eyes for Ancient Ink. At first, the promise sounded almost magical, to read a sealed scroll without opening it. Yet the reality was more demanding. Carbonized papyrus and carbon-based ink can appear very similar in scans, which makes letters difficult to distinguish. The machine could collect data, but the data had to be interpreted with extraordinary care. Technology alone was not enough. It needed trained eyes. Chapter 8. New Eyes for Ancient Ink. The first challenge was understanding shape. A Herculaneum scroll is not rolled as neatly as a modern sheet of paper. Inside, the layers may be crushed, warped, twisted, or fused. Ancient heat and later pressure changed the original form into something unpredictable. Before any words could be sought, researchers had to map this interior landscape, identifying folds, tunnels, tiers, and compressed spirals. Chapter 8. New Eyes for Ancient Ink. Once the interior geometry was captured, another step followed: virtual unwrapping. This did not mean peeling the papyrus open in the ordinary sense. Instead, software helped trace the curved surfaces of individual layers and flatten them digitally into readable planes. It was a little like taking a crumpled map, never unfolding it by hand, yet still finding a way to spread its pathways before the Chapter 8. New Eyes for Ancient Ink. Even after a surface had been digitally flattened, letters did not leap forward clearly. Researchers still needed ways to detect subtle differences that might mark ink from papyrus. This often involved searching for texture, density, or faint patterns shaped like writing. A stroke of Greek script might appear only as the softest interruption in a dark field. Discovery came not as sudden revelation, but at Chapter 8, New Eyes for Ancient Ink. Here computation became a companion to scholarship. Algorithms could help sort images, identify repeating structures, and highlight places where writing might exist. But a highlighted patch was not automatically a word, and a word was not automatically understood. Experts in ancient Greek, papyrology, imaging science, and computer analysis had to work together. The scroll demanded a kind of modern fellowship. Chapter 8. New Eyes for Ancient Ink. In earlier centuries, a damaged scroll often faced a cruel choice: remain closed forever, or be opened at terrible risk. Virtual methods introduced a third path. The object could stay physically intact while its hidden surfaces were explored in digital space. That shift was profound. It changed the work from one of extraction to one of preservation. The aim was no longer to conquer the artifact. Chapter 8. New Eyes for Ancient Ink. This patience reflects something larger about archaeology in the modern age. The discipline has increasingly learned that not every secret must be forced into view immediately. Sometimes the most respectful act is to wait for better tools, better methods, and better questions. The Herculaneum scrolls became powerful examples of that lesson. Their silence was not failure. It was an invitation to develop. Chapter 8. New Eyes for Ancient Ink. The work also depended on digital reconstruction. a phrase that sounds technical but carries a simple meaning. Fragments of information are gathered, aligned, and interpreted until a damaged object becomes legible in virtual form. With scrolls, reconstruction means restoring order to distortion, not by guessing wildly, but by measuring carefully. Each scan becomes part of a puzzle whose pieces are curves, fibers. Chapter 8. New eyes for ancient ink. Institutions and laboratories in different countries contributed to this effort over many years. Powerful scanners, specialized software, and academic collaboration all played their part. No single machine solved the mystery at once. Progress came incrementally, a clearer model here, a better segmentation there, a more convincing detection of ink in another trial. The story of modern reading was therefore Chapter 8. New eyes for ancient ink. As methods improved, the old black scroll began to look less like a ruined object and more like a preserved interior world. Within it lay sheets still coiled together, surfaces still carrying the marks of a hand long vanished. The miracle was not only that words survived Vesuvius, but that modern tools might approach them without undoing them. Fire had sealed the library shut, and science was learning. Chapter 8. New eyes for ancient ink. There is something moving in the union of old and new here. Papyrus, ink, Greek language, and Roman catastrophe belong to antiquity. X-rays, digital models, and computation belong to our own age, yet they meet in a shared act of reading. The machine does not replace the human encounter with the past. It extends it, allowing modern people to come near voices once thought permanently buried inside carbon and ash. Chapter 8. New eyes for ancient ink. For many years, public interest grew around these attempts because the stakes felt both scholarly and intimate. If the scrolls could be read safely, they might preserve lost literature, philosophical arguments, or familiar works in better copies. Every hidden line carried possibility. Yet responsible researchers remained careful not to promise too much too soon. Hope had to be balanced with evidence. Chapter 8. New eyes for ancient ink. The language used by scientists can sometimes sound austere. Segmentation, surface modeling, volume rendering, machine learning. But beneath those terms lies a deeply human desire. People want to hear from the dead without disturbing their rest more than necessary. In that sense, the equipment is not cold at all. It is a patient instrument for attention, a way of leaning close to a whisper that's Chapter 8. New eyes for ancient ink. Imagine a scholar looking not at an open manuscript on a table, but at a rotating digital volume on a screen. Inside that volume are compressed ribbons of papyrus, tangled yet traceable. The scholar marks a path along one layer, and software begins to flatten it into a surface. What appears as faint and incomplete, but suddenly there are forms that resemble letters. In such moments, history returns not loud. Chapter 8. New eyes for ancient ink. This work asked for humility because false patterns are always possible. A crack can resemble a stroke. A shadow can mimic a letter. An eager mind can complete what is not truly there. So claims had to be tested, reviewed, compared, and repeated. The discipline of caution protected the integrity of the results. To read ancient writing responsibly, one must remain willing to say not yet, even after seeing some. Chapter 8. New eyes for ancient ink. Gradually, though, the field moved forward. Better imaging produced richer data. Improved computing made it easier to process complex volumes. New methods, including approaches shaped by artificial intelligence, helped identify patterns that earlier teams struggled to isolate. None of this erased the difficulty, but it changed the horizon. What had once seemed nearly impossible began to look achievable. Not Chapter 8. New eyes for ancient ink. For the Herculaneum scrolls, this modern turn marked a quiet revolution. The central question was no longer whether another risky mechanical attempt should be made. It became whether the sealed book itself could remain whole while its contents emerged in virtual form. That idea honored both scholarship and preservation. The scroll was treated not as a problem to be broken open, but as a survivor whose internal. Chapter 8. New eyes for ancient ink. In a sense, virtual reading restored time to the process. Earlier generations often raced against fragility, fearing the artifact might crumble under delay. Modern imaging allowed researchers to pause, revisit datasets, refine methods, and return with fresh insight. A scan could be studied again years later with improved tools. The past no longer had to yield everything at once. It could be approached repeatedly. Chapter 8. New Eyes for Ancient Ink. By this stage in the story, the listener can feel a change in atmosphere. We have moved from tunnels, picks, and damaged fragments into a world of scanners, code, and digital surfaces. Yet the emotional core remains the same. Human beings are still reaching toward words left behind nearly 2,000 years ago. Only now, they do so with a tenderness earlier centuries could scarcely imagine, and perhaps. Chapter 8. New Eyes for Ancient Ink. So the chapter closes with a new kind of anticipation. The scrolls are still sealed in matter, but less sealed in possibility. Modern archaeology, imaging, and computation have opened a careful path toward the library's interior, one that does not begin with damage. The ancient voices have not fully returned yet, but the means of hearing them are finally taking shape. And in that quiet progress, the future. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the return of a voice. By June 2026, the long, patient work of scholars, imaging specialists, and computer scientists reached a moment many had hardly dared imagine. One Herculaneum scroll had been virtually unwrapped and read from beginning to end. After centuries of silence, a continuous text emerged. Not fragments only, but a flowing work in Greek, preserved since the Roman world, and legible one. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the return of a voice. The achievement did not arrive as a single dramatic gesture. It came through years of scanning, modeling, comparison, and cautious interpretation. Layer by layer, researchers learned how carbonized papyrus might still carry traces of ink too subtle for the eye alone. What seemed at first like a sealed lump of ash gradually revealed internal folds, surfaces, fibers, and at last the faint. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the return of a voice. For generations, the Herculaneum scrolls had embodied both hope and frustration. They survived the eruption of Vesuvius, yet survival itself made them almost unreachable. Fire and burial had turned them brittle and blackened, so delicate that physical opening often caused damage. Even when technology improved, certainty remained distant. Many wondered whether complete reading. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the return of a voice. What changed was not the age of the papyrus, nor the ancient hand that formed the letters, but the modern ability to listen differently. High-resolution imaging offered views beneath the outer surface. Computational methods helped separate rolled layers from one another. Pattern recognition, guided by human expertise, began distinguishing ink from papyrus. None of this reduced the wonder. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the return of a voice. When the text could finally be followed end to end, the result was astonishing for its completeness and moving for its intimacy. Here were not merely isolated words rescued from ruin, but sustained thought. Sentences connected, ideas unfolded. An author from antiquity could once again be heard in sequence, as if a door long closed had opened just enough for a living voice to cross the threshold. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the return of a voice. The writing that emerged was Greek philosophical prose, a reminder of the intellectual world once housed in the villa of the Papyri. That library had likely contained many works connected to Epicurean thought, though scholars approach each scroll with care until identification is secure. In this case, what mattered immediately was the continuity of the reading itself. A coherent. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the return of a voice. It is worth pausing over what those words had endured. They were written in ink upon papyrus in the Roman world, stored on shelves in a seaside villa, and then overtaken by the catastrophic eruption of AD 79. Heat, pressure, darkness, and burial transformed the rolls into fragile cylinders. For nearly 2,000 years, the text remained physically present yet inaccessible. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the return of a voice. To read such a scroll is not quite the same as finding a lost stone inscription or a buried coin. Those objects speak through their surfaces. A scroll speaks through its hidden interior, through layers wrapped inward upon themselves. Its message is private until someone can reach it without destroying it. That is why the June 2026 reading felt so extraordinary. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the Return of a Voice. The language of breakthrough can sometimes sound loud, but this moment invites a quieter response. Scholars did not raise the dead, and the past did not return unchanged. Instead, a chain of preservation, accident, curiosity, and method allowed an ancient document to become legible again. The miracle, if we may use that word gently, lies in continuity. The fact that thought could cross. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the Return of a Voice. Behind every readable line stood many kinds of labor. Archaeology preserved the context. Conservation protected the object. Physics enabled scanning. Computing traced concealed geometry. Classicists and papyrologists interpreted the letters and restored sense where damage obscured the text. The accomplishment belonged not to one field alone, but to a conversation across disciplines. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the Return of a Voice. There is also something deeply human in the modesty of the recovered material. Philosophical writing does not arrive with volcanic grandeur. It reasons, reflects, considers, and proceeds step by step. Yet perhaps that is what makes the event so affecting. A city met catastrophe, a library burned and was buried, centuries passed, and what returned was not noise but thought. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the Return of a Voice. For listeners tonight, the image may be simple and almost tender. Imagine a darkened roll, no larger than what the hand can hold, resting in careful light. No one forces it open, no blade touches it. Instead, invisible instruments look within, and software maps the curled interior. Then slowly, the hidden lines begin to appear. First uncertain, then clearer, until language gathers. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the Return of a Voice. Even in celebration, responsible scholarship remains cautious. Readings must be checked, letter by letter. Interpretations are tested, revised, and compared against known hands, vocabulary, and philosophical traditions. That care does not diminish the emotional power of the moment. On the contrary, it deepens it. Because the work is so exacting, the emergence of each confirmed word feels earned. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the Return of a Voice. The Herculaneum scrolls have long symbolized a limit in our knowledge of the ancient world. We knew a library survived, yet much of it remained sealed in silence. With the June 2026 reading, that limit shifted. Not every question was answered, and not every scroll yielded its contents. But a boundary moved. What had belonged to the category of impossible began, quietly. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the Return of a Voice. One can imagine the original act of writing. A scribe or author bends over papyrus, shaping Greek letters in dark ink. The work is copied, stored, and placed among other rolls in a villa overlooking the Bay of Naples. Daily life continues around it, then history closes in with terrible speed. To know that those marks can now be read again is to feel time folding gently back upon itself. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the Return of a Voice. The phrase return of a voice is, of course, metaphorical. Ancient authors do not speak exactly as we do, and texts do not carry breath. Yet anyone who has read a writer from long ago knows the sensation. Across damage and distance, a mind becomes perceptible. Choices of argument, rhythm, emphasis, and vocabulary create presence. June 2026 offered that presence anew. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the Return of a Voice. This milestone also renewed interest in the unopened rolls that remain. If one scroll could be virtually unwrapped and read continuously, others might follow. Each unopened cylinder now holds not only mystery, but plausible promise. Some may contain familiar authors, others unknown works, perhaps even texts lost everywhere else. The future remains uncertain, yet no longer abstract. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the return of a voice. For the history of books, the implications are immense. The Villa of the Papyri contains the only surviving library from classical antiquity ever found substantially intact. Every readable scroll adds not just content, but context, evidence of collection, reading habits, intellectual networks, and Roman cultural life. A complete virtual reading strengthens that whole picture. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the return of a voice. Yet perhaps the most moving aspect is also the simplest. Someone wrote these words expecting another person to read them. That ordinary expectation was interrupted by disaster on an unimaginable scale. Still, against every probability, the chain of communication was not entirely broken. It stretched across eruption, burial, excavation, damage, and centuries of waiting, until at last. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the return of a voice. There is a gentle lesson here about knowledge itself. Not all recoveries come through conquest or speed. Some require restraint, the willingness not to force open what one hopes to understand. The Herculaneum breakthrough depended on waiting for the right methods, honoring fragility, and accepting slow progress. In a restless age, that patience feels almost philosophical in its own. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the return of a voice. If we listen closely, the emotional weight of this event lies in contrast. Vesuvius destroyed homes, interrupted lives, and sealed the town beneath volcanic deposits. Nothing about that disaster was gentle. And yet, from within its aftermath emerged a strangely quiet gift, not treasure in gold, but thought in ink. The violence of the eruption preserved what time might otherwise have. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the return of a voice. So the June 2026 reading stands as both scholarly achievement and human encounter. It honors those who built the tools, those who preserved the fragments, and those ancient readers and writers whose world vanished in AD 79. The event joins technical brilliance to humility. However advanced the methods, their final purpose was beautifully simple: to let an old. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the return of a voice. As this chapter settles, we can picture the Bay of Naples under evening light, the buried villa beneath the earth, and within it the memory of shelves once lined with old papyrus. For centuries, those shelves suggested absence. Now they suggest return. Not complete return, not yet, but enough to change the story. An ancient library has begun, very slowly, to open its eyes and look back. Chapter 9, June 2026, and the return of a voice. And so we arrive at a moment of calm wonder. Nearly 2 millennia after the eruption, words written in the ancient Mediterranean became legible again from beginning to end. The feat belongs to science, scholarship, and perseverance, but also to something quieter, the enduring human wish to speak across time. In that June breakthrough, the past did not merely survive. For a little. Chapter 10, the long breath of memory. Now the story softens, and Herculaneum rests before us not only as a place of ruin, but as a place of lives once gently lived. Behind the ash and stone were cups on tables, lamps by walls, sandals by doors, and words carefully stored on shelves. As we reach this final chapter, we listen not for catastrophe alone, but for the quiet persistence of memory. Chapter 10, the long breath of memory. In the ancient town, daily life once moved with unremarkable grace. Water splashed in basins, footsteps crossed polished floors, and voices drifted through shaded courtyards. Meals were prepared, letters considered, and scrolls unrolled in rooms made cool against the southern heat. That ordinary rhythm is part of what makes Herculaneum so moving. Its people were not legends to themselves, only neighbors. Chapter 10, the long breath of memory. When Vesuvius erupted in AD 79, that ordinary world ended with terrible suddenness. Yet what followed was not simple disappearance. Buried under deep volcanic material, parts of Herculaneum were sealed in ways that preserved wood, food, furniture, and carbonized books unlike anything found elsewhere in the Roman world. Loss remained immense, but preservation entered the story too, harshly, strangely. Chapter 10, The long breath of memory. The villa of the Papyri became the clearest symbol of that paradox. A grand Roman house, likely linked to an elite family, it held a library of philosophical works written in Greek. When excavators reached those rooms in the 18th century, they encountered blackened rolls that looked at first like lumps of charcoal. Few could have guessed that these dark cylinders still carried the breath of ancient. Chapter 10. The long breath of memory. Libraries are fragile things. They depend on dry shelves, careful hands, and the peaceful passing of time. Fire, flood, conquest, neglect, and accident have erased countless collections across history. That is why Herculaneum feels so extraordinary. Here, amid destruction, a library endured in altered form, not intact in comfort, but intact in survival, silent, sealed, and waiting through centuries beneath. Chapter 10. The long breath of memory. To think of those scrolls is to think of patience. They survived not because anyone planned their rescue, but because chance preserved what violence threatened to erase. Then, after their discovery, another long patience began. Generations of scholars, conservators, and readers faced the same question. How do you hear a text that cannot safely be opened? How do you recover meaning without destruction? Chapter 10. The long breath of memory. Some scrolls were physically opened in earlier centuries, often with painful difficulty, and many suffered damage in the attempt. Others remained closed, too delicate for force. For a long time it seemed possible that much of the library would remain forever unread. Yet the desire to understand did not fade. It only changed its methods, moving from blades and pressure toward imaging, digital reconstruction. Chapter 10. The long breath of memory. That long effort reached a remarkable moment in June 2026, when researchers announced an end-to-end virtual unwrapping and reading of a Herculaneum scroll. Using advanced scanning and computational analysis, they traced writing hidden inside the rolled material without physically opening it. The recovered text was Greek philosophical writing, carried across nearly 2,000 years by Chapter 10. The long breath of memory. There is something deeply soothing in that image, a mind from antiquity speaking again through tools its author could never have dreamed of. The scroll did not return to us in the old way, through ink plainly visible on an open page. It returned through shadows, density, pattern, and code. Yet the purpose remained familiar. One human being leaving thought behind for another human being to receive. Chapter 10. The long breath of memory. Herculaneum therefore belongs to two times at once. It belongs to the ancient world of Roman houses, seaside air, and philosophical reading. And it belongs to our own age of scanners, archives, and collaborative research across continents. The buried town asks old questions in new forms. What is worth saving? What survives by chance? And how far will people go to listen carefully to voices almost lost? Chapter 10. The long breath of memory. Memory itself is like a buried city. Some parts remain near the surface, easy to revisit. Other parts sink deeper, covered by years, waiting for some small shift to bring them back into view. A smell, a line of text, a familiar light in late afternoon, these can uncover whole rooms within us. Herculaneum invites that comparison, because it reminds us that forgetting is rarely complete and recovery is rarely final. Chapter 10. The long breath of memory. The people of Herculaneum did not know they were leaving evidence for distant centuries. They folded cloth, tended fires, discussed ideas, and moved through their days with the same ordinary uncertainty that shapes every human life. That may be why their presence feels close to us now. Across the gap of time, we recognize the simple architecture of living: shelter, routine, learning, affection, hope. Chapter 10. The long breath of memory. A library, after all, is more than a room of texts. It is a vote of confidence in the future. To collect writing is to believe that tomorrow matters, that someone not yet present may one day need these words. The Villa Library at Herculaneum still carries that feeling. Even in damaged form, it tells us that thought was meant to travel onward, beyond one household, one generation, one lifetime. Chapter 10. the long breath of memory. We often imagine history as grand events, eruptions, emperors, discoveries, and turning points. But Herculaneum also teaches a quieter lesson. History lives in domestic spaces, in reading habits, in storage jars and benches and pauses between conversations, and in the calm decision to place one scroll beside another on a shelf. Civilizations are not only built by spectacle, they are built by repeated acts. Chapter 10, the long breath of memory. The buried scrolls also remind us that knowledge can sleep without dying. For centuries, the words remained inaccessible, but not absent. They persisted in a state between silence and speech, awaiting tools delicate enough to meet them where they were. There is comfort in that. Not everything lost is lost forever. Some things rest beyond our reach until patience, humility, and new understanding slowly open the Chapter 10, the long breath of memory. In this sense, Herculaneum is not only a site of tragedy, it is also a site of reunion. Archaeologists meet households they never knew. Readers meet authors separated from them by millennia. Fragments meet interpretation. And we, listening now, meet a town that once seemed sealed away beyond return. The meeting is imperfect, of course, but imperfect contact is still contact, enough to stir wonder, sorrow. Chapter 10, the long breath of memory. There is a tenderness in imagining the library rooms once more. Shelves lined with rolls, voices low, daylight filtered through architecture designed for shade and thought. Outside, the rhythms of the town continue. Footsteps, commerce, sea air, garden sound. Inside, ideas were being preserved through copying, collecting, and care. That scene vanished in fire and ash, yet somehow part of it remained. Chapter 10, the long breath of memory. The modern effort to read the scrolls carries its own kind of reverence. It asks researchers to move slowly, to respect the limits of fragile evidence, and to accept that discovery is often incremental. In a hurried world, that pace feels almost ancient in the best sense. It honors the material, honors the dead, and honors the simple truth that some doors in history open only when approached with extraordinary. Chapter 10, the long breath of memory. Perhaps that is why this story lingers so peacefully at the end. Herculaneum does not offer easy triumph. It offers continuity. The town was buried, found, studied, and listened to again. The scrolls were damaged, preserved, scanned, and partly restored to language. Nothing here escapes mortality, yet neither does everything vanish. Between disappearance and survival, Herculaneum occupies a quiet middle ground. Chapter 10, the long breath of memory. If we imagine the town tonight, we might picture it not as empty, but as resting. Streets lie still. Walls hold their warmth no longer, yet they keep their shape. Rooms wait with patient dignity. The villa library remains one of the most moving rooms of all, not because it is complete, but because it proves that thought can endure even after fire, burial, and centuries of silence. Chapter 10, the long breath of memory. So the final lesson of Herculaneum may be this. Human beings are never only as brief as their lives. We extend ourselves into objects, buildings, habits, and words. We leave traces in what we make and what we preserve. Sometimes those traces vanish, sometimes they sleep, and sometimes, against all expectation, they return to the light carrying the unmistakable presence of a mind still reaching outward. Chapter 10, the long breath of memory. As this journey draws to a close, let the image settle gently within you. A buried library by the Bay of Naples, dark for centuries, still holding thought in reserve. Let the noise of catastrophe fade, and let the quieter truth remain. Books can wait. Memory can wait. Even under ash, the wish to speak and to be heard can survive far longer than you imagine. Chapter 10, the long breath of memory. And perhaps that is why Herculaneum feels less like a vanished place than a listening room. It has waded through excavation tunnels, scholarly debates, careful conservation, and new technologies. It has waited while generations learned how to ask better questions. The town does not rush its answers. It offers them slowly in fragments and whispers. enough to remind us that the past is not dead. Chapter 10, the long breath of memory. Now we leave the town in stillness. The sea remains nearby, the mountain stands in shadow. Beneath the long history of destruction and recovery, something gentle endures. The faith that words matter, that memory can be tended, and that lost voices may one day be heard again. Let Herculaneum rest there in your mind tonight, not gone, but patient, holding its silence like a final breath.